Another way for a contract to come to an end is if a party fails to fulfill its obligations. This is called a contractual breach, a breach of contract. These are the circumstances where a commercial relationship can potentially get ugly. For the duration of this video, I'm going to talk about the details surrounding what is a contractual breach, what is it not, and what are the avenues that an innocent party has. For right now, though, it's important to know two things, that there are really two options that may or may not be available to an innocent party. They're either going to be able to accept the breach of contract, discharge the contract so that there's no more performance, they don't have to perform, and go sue for damages. Or even though there is a breach of contract, if that breach is relatively minor, the innocent party will still have to perform their end of the bargain. They'll still have to perform their end of the obligations, but they will just be able to sue for damages. Now, what does it mean to have a contract discharged for breach of contract? Unlike when a contract is void or a contract is rescinded, a contract that has been discharged for breach still exists. That means that the secondary obligations still exist, and it forms the basis for contractual damages, which we'll talk about in another class. The parties no longer have to perform their obligations, but the contract does exist for those remedies. It's important that contracts with items such as exclusion clauses or confidentiality clauses, basically clauses that are kind of secondary to the main agreement, but clauses that you want to exist for a long duration, will continue to exist if a contract has been discharged for breach. Now, whether or not an innocent party is going to be able to discharge a contract for breach or is going to have to continue performing their obligations and still sue for damages depends on whether the breach is a breach of a condition or a warranty. So, conditions and warranties. There are two types, there's actually three, but for now, all of the terms in an agreement can be categorized into two different types. There are conditions, which are main terms. They are terms that go to the heart of the contract. They are terms that, if they are breached, they will result in substantial deprivation of the benefits of the contract. And there are warranties. These are sort of minor secondary promises or contractual obligations that kind of float around, outside of the main point of the contract. Now, there are two different types, but I did stumble there for a second and mention that there are actually three. And the third type is a type of term called an innominate term or an intermediate term. And it's really a wait and see term. It's a term where the breach could be varied. There are multiple ways to breach this type of term. And so the parties don't really know at the outset if the breach is going to be one that's really bad and go to the heart of the contract and therefore be a condition, or if the breach is going to be relatively minor and not actually go to the heart of the contract and therefore be considered a warranty. These are called wait and see terms. So consider the example of renting a U-Haul to move. Obviously, a condition of the U-Haul is going to be that it's roadworthy. That is going to be a condition. It's a very important term to the contract. Whereas, compare that to having a stereo. Perhaps if you get a van that shows up at your door that doesn't have a stereo in it, technically, the performance may not be exact, and therefore there may be a contractual breach, but it's probably a breach of warranty. It doesn't actually go to the heart of needing a U-Haul that actually can haul stuff. Now, an example of an innominate term or an intermediate term is a situation where, say, I'm purchasing a building and the seller represents that the building complies with all building codes. We may find out afterwards that the building itself has structural issues and the whole thing has to be demolished. That's pretty significant and goes to the heart of the contract. That would be a significant breach, and it would be a breach of a condition. But that same term, that the seller represents that the building complies with building codes may also be violated by simply, having the wrong amount of fire extinguishers, which is probably a rather minor breach in comparison to requiring the complete demolition of the building. Of course, it's important to remember that the parties can always elect in their agreement to what they want to consider a condition and what they want to consider a warranty. There are multiple ways in which a party can breach a contract. The first one is defective performance. We've talked about performance in other videos. For the purposes of this, just know that where a party fails to fulfill the strict terms of the contract, technically, their performance is defective. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get damages. It's distinctly possible that their defective performance is not going to cause any economic loss. Another example of a contractual breach is something called deviation, and it's specific to shipping. It is very important in the world of intermodal shipping that specific routes be used for insurance purposes. The insurer is going to want to know whether your goods are going by plane, train, or automobile. And if those goods are shipped in a manner other than what is contractually agreed upon, that is considered a breach of contract, otherwise known as deviation. Now, there may be circumstances in which a party is not yet having to fulfill its obligations, but it can see out in the future that it's not going to be able to meet its end of the bargain. It anticipates that it is going to be in breach of a contract. Say, for instance, I enter into a contract whereby I agree to deliver you a vehicle on April 30th. If I learn today that I can't do it, and I tell you today that I can't do it, I have committed what's called an anticipatory breach. Technically, I haven't breached my obligations because they're not due yet, but I have put you on notice that I'm not going to fulfill my end of the bargain. You, as the innocent party, have an option. You can elect to accept my breach, discharge the contract, and sue for damages. Just say, okay, you've breached. Here we go. I will sue for damages and I will move on. Or you can refuse my breach, insist on performance of the contract, and basically wait and see to see if maybe I am going to be able to perform the contract once April 30th comes around. But that avenue should be taken with a little bit of caution, because if it turns out that something happens and I suddenly am able to perform my end of the bargain on April 30th and you can't, you are now the party in breach, not me.